It was May 10th, 1942. In a secure meeting room at Soviet headquarters near Moscow, Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood before a map of southern Ukraine and said words that would haunt Soviet military leadership for years. He told Stalin and the assembled generals that launching an offensive toward Kharkov was strategically unsound. German forces in the region were stronger than Soviet intelligence estimated. The offensive would overextend Soviet forces and create vulnerable flanks that German mobile reserves could exploit. Stalin should postpone the offensive until Soviet forces built overwhelming superiority. What Zhukov said was tactically correct and strategically wise. Stalin ignored him completely. 2 weeks later, over 270,000 Soviet soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured in one of the war's worst Soviet defeats. The disaster at Kharkov demonstrated that knowing the right answer means nothing if political authorities refuse to listen. The context for the Kharkov offensive began with Soviet success during winter 1941 to 1942. Soviet forces had stopped German advance at Moscow's gates and launched counteroffensives that drove Wehrmacht back from the capital. For the first time since June 1941, Soviet forces were advancing and Germans were retreating. This success created dangerous optimism in Stalin's headquarters. The Red Army had proven it could defeat the supposedly invincible Wehrmacht. Stalin became convinced that continued offensive operations would collapse German forces completely. He ordered preparation for spring offensives across the entire front, from Leningrad to the Black Sea. These offensives would destroy German armies before they could recover from winter defeats. We'll pause briefly before continuing. If stories like this are important to you, please consider supporting the video with a like and a subscription. After watching, a short comment, even a simple one, helps these stories reach further. Your support ensures they are not forgotten. Thank you. Let's continue. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko commanded the Southwestern Front, responsible for operations in Ukraine. Timoshenko was loyal to Stalin, but had limited military competence. He had failed catastrophically in earlier operations, but retained command through political connections and willingness to tell Stalin what Stalin wanted to hear. In April 1942, Timoshenko proposed an offensive to recapture Kharkov, Ukraine's second-largest city. Kharkov had symbolic and strategic importance. Its capture would boost Soviet morale and threaten German supply lines supporting their southern armies. Stalin approved the operation immediately, seeing it as opportunity for decisive victory that would vindicate his offensive strategy. But there were problems with the plan that Timoshenko either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. Soviet intelligence had an incomplete picture of German forces in the region. Aerial reconnaissance was limited by German air superiority. Soviet agents behind German lines provided fragmentary information that was difficult to verify. Soviet commanders believed German forces around Kharkov were weak and demoralized from winter fighting. This assessment was dangerously wrong. German forces had used the spring thaw period to regroup and receive reinforcements. Wehrmacht had positioned mobile reserves, particularly armoured divisions, exactly where they could counterattack Soviet offensive operations. Zhukov saw the problems immediately when briefed on Timoshenko's plan. Soviet forces designated for the offensive were insufficient for their mission. The attack would create a salient jutting into German-held territory, vulnerable to counterattacks from both flanks. Soviet reserves were inadequate to defend those flanks or exploit any breakthrough the offensive achieved. German mobile forces, if they existed in strength that Zhukov suspected, could cut off the entire Soviet offensive force by attacking the base of the salient. Zhukov's concerns were based on careful analysis of German operational methods observed over a year of warfare. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized counterattacking overextended Soviet formations. The Kharkov offensive would create exactly the conditions that German doctrine was designed to exploit. Zhukov presented his concerns to Stalin on May 10th. The meeting was tense. Stalin had already approved the operation and didn't appreciate subordinates questioning his decisions. Zhukov argued that Soviet intelligence about German strength was inadequate. He recommended postponing the offensive until Soviet forces could conduct proper reconnaissance and accumulate sufficient reserves. If the offensive proceeded, Zhukov suggested reducing its objectives and strengthening flank protection. These were reasonable military recommendations based on sound operational analysis, but Stalin interpreted Zhukov's caution as defeatism. The Marshal was exhibiting the pessimism that had characterized old Tsarist generals. The Red Army didn't need excessive caution. It needed bold offensive action that would destroy fascist invaders. Other generals present at the meeting remained silent. They recognized Zhukov's analysis was correct, but also knew that contradicting Stalin was dangerous. Several generals had been arrested or executed for less serious disagreements with Stalin's views. The atmosphere in Stalin's headquarters combined military planning with political theatre, where survival required agreeing with Stalin regardless of professional judgment. Zhukov's willingness to contradict Stalin openly marked him as either extraordinarily brave or dangerously naive about Soviet political realities. In the event, it marked him as right about military matters, but powerless to change decisions that Stalin had already made for political reasons. The Kharkov offensive began on May 12, 1942. Soviet forces attacked with approximately 640,000 soldiers, over 1,200 tanks, and substantial artillery support. The initial attacks achieved tactical success. Soviet forces broke through German defensive lines and advanced toward Kharkov. German resistance was significant, but seemed to be crumbling under Soviet pressure. By May 17th, Soviet forces had advanced nearly 50 kilometers and appeared to be on the verge of major breakthrough. Timoshenko reported to Stalin that the offensive was succeeding brilliantly. Soviet forces would capture Kharkov within days. The skeptics, including Zhukov, had been proven wrong. But on May 17th, German forces launched Operation Frederikus, a counter-offensive that transformed the situation catastrophically. Wehrmacht General Ewald von Kleist commanded German mobile forces positioned south of the Soviet offensive. Kleist had waited patiently for Soviet forces to advance far enough to create vulnerable flanks. On May 17th, he struck with overwhelming force at the southern flank of the Soviet salient. German panzer divisions smashed through Soviet defensive positions and drove north, aiming to encircle the entire Soviet offensive force. Simultaneously, German forces attacked the northern flank of the salient. Within hours, Soviet commanders realized they faced disaster. The offensive that had seemed successful was becoming a trap. Timoshenko requested permission to halt the offensive and withdraw forces before they were encircled. Stalin refused. The offensive would continue as planned. Soviet forces would break through to Kharkov regardless of German counterattacks. Stalin's decision reflected his belief that retreat was always wrong and that aggressive offensive action would overcome any tactical setback. This belief had no basis in military reality, but was consistent with Stalin's personality and his interpretation of Marxist-Leninist ideology about the inevitability of socialist victory. Timoshenko, unwilling to disobey direct orders, continued offensive operations even as his flanks collapsed and German forces closed the encirclement. By May 23rd, the situation was hopeless. German pincers had closed behind Soviet offensive forces, trapping over 200,000 soldiers in a pocket. Soviet units inside the encirclement fought desperately to break out, but German forces held the perimeter. Soviet reserves attempted to break through the encirclement from outside, but these efforts were poorly coordinated and easily defeated by German defenders. The pocket contracted day by day as German forces compressed Soviet forces into smaller area. Ammunition and food supplies were exhausted. medical care for thousands of wounded was non-existent. Soviet commanders radioed increasingly desperate requests for permission to surrender or authorization for individual units to attempt breakout. Stalin refused all such requests. Soviet forces would fight to the last man. Surrender was prohibited. The pocket was finally eliminated by May 28th. Over 230,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. German forces destroyed or captured over 1,200 Soviet tanks and over 2,000 artillery pieces. The losses exceeded those suffered in any previous Soviet defeat, except for the initial disasters of summer 1941. An entire Soviet army group had been effectively annihilated. The loss of experienced officers and trained soldiers was particularly devastating. These were troops who had survived nearly a year of warfare and gained combat experience. Replacing them with hastily trained recruits would take months and would mean Soviet forces in the south were significantly weaker for the remainder of 1942. The strategic consequences extended beyond immediate losses. The Kharkov disaster left the entire southern sector of the front vulnerable. German forces could now launch their own offensive operations without facing significant Soviet resistance. This created conditions for Operation Blue, Germany's summer 1942 offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields. That offensive would eventually lead to the Battle of Stalingrad and some of the war's most intense fighting. But the initial German success in reaching the Volga River and threatening Soviet oil supplies was made possible by the weakened Soviet forces resulting from Kharkov's disaster. Stalin's refusal to listen to Zhukov's warning had created strategic vulnerability that threatened Soviet survival. Stalin's immediate response to the disaster was characteristic. He blamed everyone except himself. Timoshenko was demoted and removed from command. Other generals involved in planning the offensive faced arrest and possible execution. The NKVD investigated whether the defeat resulted from treachery or sabotage rather than military incompetence and political interference. Zhukov, who had opposed the offensive, was perversely blamed for not opposing it more vigorously. This was typical Stalinist logic. If you were right about something bad happening, you were responsible for not preventing it, even if you had no authority to prevent it. Zhukov kept his position through combination of proven competence and Stalin's recognition that competent military commanders were scarce. The political impact within Soviet leadership was complex. Stalin couldn't publicly acknowledge that his own decisions had caused disaster. Soviet propaganda blamed German numerical superiority and treacherous attacks. The official narrative portrayed Soviet forces as fighting heroically against overwhelming odds rather than being trapped through poor strategic planning and refusal to authorize tactical withdrawals. This narrative served domestic propaganda purposes, but prevented honest assessment of what had gone wrong. Officers who understood the real causes of the defeat knew better than to discuss them openly. The lessons that should have been learned from Kharkov were suppressed because learning them would require acknowledging Stalin's errors. Zhukov's warnings about the offensive had been specific and prescient. He had predicted that German forces were stronger than estimated. He had predicted that the offensive would create vulnerable flanks. He had predicted that inadequate reserves would prevent Soviet forces from exploiting success or defending against counterattacks. Every prediction proved accurate. But being right provided no satisfaction because being right hadn't prevented disaster. Zhukov learned a bitter lesson about Soviet decision-making. Tactical and strategic correctness mattered less than political acceptability. Stalin made decisions based on ideological beliefs and political considerations. Military advice that contradicted Stalin's preconceptions was dismissed regardless of its merit. The experience shaped Zhukov's subsequent career. He learned to present military advice in ways that Stalin might accept, rather than in direct contradiction to Stalin's views. He learned to build political support for his recommendations among other generals and civilian officials before presenting them to Stalin. He learned when to fight for critical issues and when to accept Stalin's decisions even when he believed they were wrong. This political sophistication, combined with undeniable military competence, allowed Zhukov to survive and eventually become Soviet Union's most important military commander. But the cost was compromise with a system that valued political loyalty over military effectiveness. The German perspective on the Kharkov operation reveals their understanding of Soviet decision-making weaknesses. Wehrmacht intelligence knew that Soviet offensive planning was often driven by political imperatives rather than military logic. Stalin's need for victories to prove socialist systems' superiority made him prone to ordering offensives that weren't militarily justified. German commanders learned to position their mobile reserves to exploit these predictable Soviet operational patterns. The Kharkov offensive fell perfectly into this pattern. Soviet forces attacked predictably, created vulnerable flanks predictably, and persisted in their offensive beyond the point of military rationality predictably. German operational planning at Kharkov was effective partly because Soviet decision-making was so dysfunctional. The human cost of the disaster deserves emphasis beyond simple casualty statistics. Over 230,000 Soviet soldiers, killed or captured, represents individual tragedies multiplied beyond comprehension. Each casualty was a person with family, friends, and life interrupted or ended by decisions made in distant headquarters. Many captured Soviet soldiers would die in German prisoner of war camps where mortality rates exceeded 80%. Soviet soldiers knew this fate awaited them if captured, which made fighting in hopeless encirclements psychologically torturous. They could surrender and face near-certain death in German captivity, or they could fight on knowing they would be killed in combat. Either choice led to death. Stalin's prohibition on surrender removed even the slim hope of survival through captivity. The families of soldiers lost at Kharkov often received no information about their loved ones' fates. Soviet authorities were secretive about military casualties, particularly in disasters like Kharkov. Families would simply stop receiving letters and then wait months or years for official notification of death or missing status. The uncertainty was psychological torture comparable to the combat itself. Soviet systems' lack of concern for individual soldiers' lives or their families' grief was characteristic of Stalin's rule. Soldiers were resources to be expended in service of political objectives. Their deaths mattered only insofar as they affected military capabilities. The comparison between Kharkov in May 1942 and Moscow in December 1941 is instructive. At Moscow, Zhukov had commanded the defense and subsequent counteroffensive. He made decisions based on careful analysis of German capabilities and Soviet resources. He refused to launch attacks that weren't properly prepared, even when Stalin pressured him for immediate action. The Moscow operation succeeded precisely because Zhukov exercised professional military judgment without excessive political interference. At Kharkov, political imperatives overrode military judgment. Stalin wanted victory for political reasons and refused to accept military advice that contradicted his desires. The contrast demonstrates how political interference in military operations produces disasters, regardless of soldiers' courage or commanders' tactical skills. The lessons of Kharkov were eventually learned, but only after more disasters had occurred. By late 1942, after further defeats in southern Russia, Stalin began giving his military commanders more operational freedom. The success at Stalingrad in winter 1942-1943 reflected this changed approach. Stalin still made strategic decisions, but operational planning was left to professional military commanders like Zhukov, who could implement their plans without constant political interference. This more rational command structure contributed significantly to subsequent Soviet victories. But the learning process required disasters like Kharkov to convince Stalin that military professionals knew more about military operations than political leaders did. The institutional changes that eventually emerged from disasters like Kharkov were significant. Soviet military command structure became more professionalized. Political commissars' power to override military commanders' decisions was reduced. Military officers received better training in operational planning. Intelligence gathering and analysis improved. These changes accumulated gradually throughout 1942 and 1943, producing Soviet military that was far more effective by 1944 than it had been in 1942. But every improvement was purchased with blood. Soldiers died in disasters like Kharkov, while Soviet systems slowly learned lessons that professional militaries in other countries had learned decades earlier. The question of whether the Kharkov offensive could have succeeded if Stalin had listened to Zhukov is counterfactual but important. If the offensive had been postponed until adequate reserves were available, if reconnaissance had been improved to get accurate picture of German strength, if contingency plans for withdrawal had been prepared in case the offensive stalled, the outcome might have been different. Soviet forces might still have failed to capture Kharkov because German defences were strong, but they wouldn't have been encircled and destroyed because proper planning would have prevented the vulnerable salient and provided means to withdraw when the situation deteriorated. The disaster wasn't inevitable. It resulted from specific bad decisions that could have been avoided if Stalin had listened to professional military advice. The political mythology that developed around Kharkov in Soviet historical narratives obscured the disaster's real causes. Soviet histories portrayed the battle as heroic resistance against overwhelming German forces. The encirclement was attributed to German numerical superiority and surprise rather than to Soviet strategic incompetence and refusal to authorize timely withdrawals. Zhukov's warnings and Stalin's rejection of those warnings were omitted from official accounts. The narrative served political purposes by avoiding any suggestion that Stalin's leadership was flawed, but it prevented honest historical understanding and meant future Soviet leaders couldn't learn appropriate lessons from the disaster. Post-Soviet Russian histories have been somewhat more honest about Kharkov, but still struggle with how to portray Stalin's role. Russian national pride requires recognizing that the Great Patriotic War was won through Soviet sacrifices. Acknowledging that many of those sacrifices were unnecessary and resulted from Stalin's poor decision-making complicates this narrative. Modern Russian historians generally admit that Kharkov was disaster caused by poor planning and command decisions, but they often stop short of directly criticizing Stalin's personal role, preferring to blame unnamed Soviet leadership or systemic problems rather than identifying specific decisions by specific individuals that caused specific disasters. The memory of Kharkov among veterans who survived was complex and painful. They knew their comrades had died in disaster that was preventable. They knew commanders had warned about problems that were ignored. But speaking openly about these facts was dangerous in Soviet system, where criticizing Stalin or suggesting Soviet leadership made errors could result in arrest. Veterans learned to remain silent about what they knew. They told their families limited versions of events that omitted politically sensitive details. This enforced silence meant accurate historical understanding was suppressed for decades. Only in last years of Soviet system and after its collapse did fuller accounts begin emerging. The tactical lessons from Kharkov were clear to military professionals, even if political lessons couldn't be acknowledged. Offensives needed adequate reconnaissance to understand enemy capabilities. Flanks of salients needed strong defensive positions or mobile reserves to counter enemy attacks. Commanders needed authority to modify operational plans when situations changed. Withdrawal had to be authorized when encirclement threatened. These weren't sophisticated concepts. They were basic military principles that any competent staff officer understood, but Soviet command structure in 1942 prevented these principles from being applied because political imperatives overrode military logic. The comparison with German operational methods is revealing. Wehrmacht in 1942 had significant problems including overextended supply lines, declining troop quality as casualties mounted, and Hitler's increasing interference in military decisions. But German command culture still allowed considerable operational freedom to field commanders. German generals could make tactical decisions based on battlefield realities rather than distant political considerations. This flexibility gave German forces significant advantages in battles like Kharkov, where they could respond to developing situations quickly while Soviet forces waited for authorization from Moscow. The Kharkov disaster's long-term impact on Soviet military development was substantial but indirect. The immediate lessons about operational planning and command authority were learned gradually through 1942 and 1943. But the deeper lesson about political interference in military affairs couldn't be addressed while Stalin lived. Only after Stalin's death in 1953 could Soviet military fully professionalize and establish norms where military decisions were made by military professionals rather than political authorities. This delayed professionalization meant Soviet military carried scars from disasters like Kharkov throughout the Cold War. The institutional memory of how political interference produced military catastrophe influenced Soviet military culture for decades. The human stories from Kharkov that survive reveal courage wasted through incompetent leadership. Soviet soldiers fought desperately in hopeless situations because they had no choice. Officers made tactical decisions that they knew were futile because orders from above prohibited rational responses to battlefield realities. The courage and sacrifice of individual soldiers and junior officers couldn't compensate for strategic incompetence at highest levels of command. This disconnect between tactical effectiveness and strategic dysfunction characterized much of early Soviet war effort. It began to resolve only when Stalin, forced by repeated disasters, grudgingly allowed military professionals more authority over military operations. What Zhukov said on May 10, 1942, was military wisdom based on professional analysis of operational realities. His warnings were ignored because they contradicted Stalin's political imperatives and ideological beliefs. The resulting disaster killed or captured over 230,000 soldiers, weakened Soviet forces in the south catastrophically, and created conditions for German offensive that would lead to Stalingrad. The lesson was brutally simple. Being right about military matters means nothing if political authorities refuse to listen. Competent military advice, rejected for political reasons, produces disasters, regardless of soldiers' courage or battlefield effectiveness. Zhukov's warning about Kharkov became one of many examples in World War II where professional military judgment was overruled by political leaders convinced that their ideological certainty outweighed military expertise. The casualties resulting from such decisions, measured in hundreds of thousands, demonstrated the fatal consequences of political interference in military operations. The specific sequence of events during the encirclement reveals how disaster unfolded day by day. On May 18th, Soviet commanders first reported German counterattacks on both flanks of the salient. The reports indicated significant German armoured forces were involved, but initial assessments minimized the threat's scale. Soviet defensive positions on the flanks were manned by lower-quality infantry divisions without adequate anti-tank weapons. These divisions had been positioned there precisely because Soviet planners assumed the flanks were secondary to the main offensive effort toward Kharkov. This assumption proved fatal. German panzer divisions struck these weak points with overwhelming force. By May 19th, the southern pincer of German counteroffensive had advanced 30 kilometers, cutting behind Soviet offensive forces. Northern pincer advanced more slowly, but still made steady progress. Soviet commanders in the field recognized immediately that they faced encirclement. General Fedot Kostenko, commanding one of the threatened armies, radioed urgent requests to halt the offensive and begin withdrawing before the trap closed. Timoshenko forwarded these requests to Stalin with his own recommendation that withdrawal be authorized. Stalin's response came within hours: continue the offensive, ignore German attacks on the flanks, Soviet reserves would counterattack and eliminate the German penetrations. These reserves didn't exist in sufficient strength to accomplish this mission. May 20th brought desperate fighting as Soviet forces tried simultaneously to advance toward Kharkov and defend against German flank attacks. This divided effort meant neither mission could be accomplished effectively. Units advancing toward Kharkov encountered stiffened German resistance as Wehrmacht pulled forces from other sectors to reinforce the threatened city. Units defending the flanks were overwhelmed by German mobile forces that bypassed strong points and drove deep into Soviet rear areas. Soviet command structure began breaking down as units lost communication with headquarters. Radio nets became clogged with contradictory orders and desperate calls for assistance. On May 21st, the German pincers were within 10 kilometers of meeting, which would seal the encirclement completely. Kostenko made direct appeal to Stalin, bypassing Timoshenko entirely. He reported that approximately 200,000 soldiers would be trapped if immediate withdrawal wasn't authorized. He stated bluntly that continuing the offensive was impossible and that defending the flanks with available forces was equally impossible. The only option was immediate withdrawal to positions where Soviet forces could establish coherent defense. Stalin's response accused Kostenko of defeatism and cowardice. The offensive would continue. Soviet forces would break through German counterattacks through revolutionary determination and superior morale. May 22nd saw the encirclement completed. German forces from north and south met at Balakleya, cutting the main supply route to Soviet forces inside the pocket. Approximately 220,000 Soviet soldiers were now trapped. Inside the pocket, Soviet commanders tried to organize defensive perimeter while simultaneously attacking outward to break the encirclement. Outside the pocket, Soviet reserves launched poorly coordinated attacks attempting to break through German lines. None of these efforts succeeded. German forces had positioned their mobile reserves precisely to defend the encirclement perimeter, while maintaining blocking positions that prevented Soviet relief forces from advancing. The conditions inside the pocket deteriorated rapidly. Ammunition stocks were depleted by May 23rd. Artillery units fired their last shells and then were used as infantry. Tank units ran out of fuel and were abandoned, their crews joining infantry formations. Food supplies were exhausted by May 24th. Soldiers subsisted on whatever they could scavenge from the battlefield. Medical supplies were gone, meaning thousands of wounded received no treatment beyond basic first aid. Field hospitals were overrun with casualties that medics couldn't help. The psychological toll of hopeless situation was as devastating as physical hardship. Soldiers knew they were abandoned, trapped by decisions made by distant commanders who refused to acknowledge reality. German forces compressed the pocket methodically, using artillery and air attacks to destroy Soviet resistance sector by sector. Luftwaffe flew continuous sorties, bombing and strafing Soviet positions with minimal interference from Soviet fighters. German artillery fired thousands of shells daily, targeting any concentration of Soviet troops. German infantry and armour advanced carefully, reducing Soviet positions through coordinated combined arms attacks. Wehrmacht had learned from earlier battles that encircled Soviet forces fought desperately. German tactics emphasized firepower and methodical advance rather than risky assaults. This approach minimized German casualties while maximizing Soviet losses. Individual Soviet units' experiences during the encirclement illustrate the human dimensions of disaster. The 6th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Alexander Gorodiansky, fought in the southern sector of the pocket. Gorodiansky had commanded this army through difficult battles over previous months and had developed it into relatively effective formation. When the encirclement closed, his army held defensive positions that might have served as foundation for breakout attempt. Gorodiansky requested permission to attempt breakout on May 23rd, when his forces still had ammunition and cohesion. Permission was denied. By May 25th, when breakout was finally authorized, his army had lost half its strength and lacked ammunition for sustained combat. The attempted breakout failed with heavy casualties. Gorodiansky was killed leading his troops in desperate assault. His army ceased to exist as organized formation. The 57th Army, commanded by Major General Kirill Podlus, experienced similar fate. This army held the northern sector of the pocket and bore the brunt of German attacks from that direction. Podlus recognized by May 20th that his army was doomed unless it withdrew immediately. He made repeated requests for withdrawal authorization, all denied. By May 26th, his army had been reduced to isolated groups fighting without central coordination. Podlus attempted to organize breakout of remaining forces on his own initiative, violating direct orders to hold position. The breakout attempt failed. Podlus was captured by German forces on May 28th. He would die in German captivity later in the war. The experiences of ordinary soldiers trapped in the pocket reveal courage wasted through command incompetence. Sergeant Ivan Morozov served in an infantry regiment that entered the pocket with approximately 3,000 soldiers. By May 24th, the regiment numbered fewer than 400 effectives. Morozov survived by volunteering for night patrols that scavenged ammunition from dead soldiers and searched for water sources. He described the psychological horror of watching his regiment disintegrate while knowing that relief wasn't coming because distant commanders refused to acknowledge reality. On May 27th, Morozov was wounded by artillery shrapnel. He was captured the next day when German forces overran the field hospital, where he sheltered with other wounded soldiers. The Soviet command's response to information from inside the pocket reveals the psychological disconnect between headquarters and battlefield reality. Radio messages from encircled forces describe deteriorating situation in desperate terms. Commanders reported they had no ammunition, no food, and mounting casualties. They requested authorization to surrender or permission for individual soldiers to attempt escape. Moscow's responses ignored these reports and repeated orders to continue fighting. At one point, Stalin sent message to encircled forces stating that the Red Army never abandoned its soldiers and that relief was coming. This was blatantly false. No relief forces were coming because Soviet reserves lacked strength to break through German lines. The message's only effect was to give false hope to soldiers who then died believing help was imminent. The final days of the pocket, May 27 to 28, were characterized by complete collapse of Soviet military structure. Units disintegrated into small groups fighting without coordination. Many soldiers attempted individual escapes, trying to infiltrate through German lines at night. Most were killed or captured. A few succeeded in reaching Soviet lines and brought back first-hand accounts of the disaster. Some Soviet units ceased organized resistance and surrendered en masse despite Stalin's prohibition. The psychological breaking point had been reached. Soldiers who had fought desperately for days without food, ammunition, or hope finally accepted that continued resistance was suicide rather than duty. The German processing of over 200,000 Soviet prisoners created its own humanitarian catastrophe. Wehrmacht prisoner of war camp system was already overwhelmed by massive numbers of Soviet prisoners captured earlier in the war. German authorities viewed Soviet prisoners as subhuman Slavs, undeserving of Geneva Convention protections. The prisoners from Kharkov were marched to collection points with minimal food or water. Those too weak to march were shot. At collection points, prisoners were held in open fields with no shelter or sanitation. Disease spread rapidly. German guards shot prisoners at random to maintain control through terror. Mortality rates in these camps exceeded 80%. Most Soviet soldiers captured at Kharkov, who didn't die immediately from wounds, died within months from starvation, disease, or execution. The strategic situation facing Soviet forces after Kharkov was desperate. The disaster had destroyed Soviet offensive capability in the south and created vulnerable sector that German forces could exploit. Wehrmacht had captured enormous quantities of Soviet military equipment along with the troops. German forces were positioned to launch their own offensive operations without significant Soviet resistance. The path was open for Operation Blue, Germany's summer offensive toward the Caucasus. That offensive would achieve initial success, partly because Soviet forces in the region were weakened by Kharkov losses and hadn't recovered strength or cohesion. Stalin's reaction to the disaster evolved through several phases. Initial response was denial. He insisted that reports of catastrophic defeat were exaggerated or reflected cowardice by commanders. As evidence became undeniable, Stalin shifted to blaming subordinates. Timoshenko was demoted but not arrested, likely because Stalin recognized that arresting the commander would implicitly acknowledge that the operation Stalin had approved was fundamentally flawed. Other generals faced courts-martial or arrest. Several were shot. The NKVD investigated whether treachery had contributed to the defeat, arresting officers who were accused of insufficient determination or suspicious conduct during the battle. The long-term impact on Stalin's relationship with his military commanders was complex. Stalin recognized at some level that his interference had contributed to disaster, but his personality couldn't accept responsibility for failure. The psychological compromise was to give military commanders slightly more operational freedom while maintaining ultimate control over strategic decisions. This semi-professionalization of Soviet command structure proceeded gradually through 1942 and 1943. By 1944, Soviet generals had considerably more authority than they possessed in 1942, but they never achieved the operational independence that German or Western Allied commanders enjoyed. Stalin remained supreme commander whose approval was required for major operations. Zhukov's personal position after Kharkov was paradoxical. His warnings had been proven correct, which might have vindicated his professional judgment. But Stalin interpreted Zhukov's correctness as implicit criticism of Stalin's decision-making. Zhukov found himself under increased scrutiny from political authorities who suspected him of harboring doubts about Stalin's leadership. He survived this dangerous period through combination of military competence that made him indispensable and political caution that avoided direct challenges to Stalin's authority. Zhukov learned to couch his professional military advice in terms that didn't directly contradict Stalin's views. This political sophistication allowed him to influence decisions while avoiding fatal confrontation with Stalin. The Soviet propaganda treatment of Kharkov was characteristic of how Stalin's regime handled military disasters. Initial reports simply didn't mention the defeat. Soviet media continued reporting non-existent victories while actual disaster unfolded. When the defeat became too obvious to ignore, propaganda minimized its scale and blamed it on overwhelming German forces and treacherous surprise attacks. Soviet soldiers were portrayed as fighting heroically against impossible odds. The narrative avoided any suggestion that poor planning or command decisions contributed to defeat. This propaganda served to maintain domestic morale, but prevented honest assessment of what had gone wrong and hindered learning of appropriate lessons. The comparative analysis of Kharkov with earlier Soviet disasters reveals patterns in Soviet command dysfunction. The disasters of summer 1941, when German invasion destroyed massive Soviet forces, resulted partly from Stalin's refusal to believe that Germany would attack and his prohibition on defensive preparations. The Kiev encirclement in September 1941 where approximately 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, resulted from Stalin's refusal to authorize withdrawal until encirclement was complete. Kharkov followed the same pattern. Professional military commanders recognized problems, recommended actions to mitigate them, and were overruled by Stalin's political imperatives. The pattern would continue through 1942 until mounting disasters finally forced Stalin to delegate more operational authority to military professionals. The human legacy of Kharkov extended beyond those killed or captured in the battle. The widows and orphans of soldiers lost in the disaster faced difficult lives in Soviet system that provided minimal support for military families. Many families never learned exact circumstances of their soldier's death, receiving only notification that he was missing or killed in action. The psychological toll of ambiguous loss persisted for decades. Soviet system's secrecy about military disasters meant families couldn't grieve properly because they didn't know what happened. This enforced ignorance added psychological trauma to material hardship of losing family breadwinners. The military lessons that should have been learned from Kharkov were eventually incorporated into Soviet doctrine, but only after more disasters had occurred. The importance of adequate reconnaissance before offensive operations became standard emphasis in Soviet planning. The need for strong reserves to defend flanks or exploit success was acknowledged. The authority of field commanders to modify plans based on battlefield realities was somewhat expanded. The recognition that withdrawal was sometimes necessary tactical maneuver rather than cowardly betrayal gradually became accepted. These lessons improved Soviet military effectiveness substantially by 1943 to 1944. But they were purchased with blood of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who died in disasters like Kharkov, while Soviet command structure learned through painful experience. The irony of Kharkov is that the disaster was completely avoidable. If Stalin had listened to Zhukov on May 10th, if the offensive had been postponed or better prepared, if commanders had been authorized to withdraw when encirclement threatened, the catastrophic outcome could have been prevented. Soviet forces might still have failed to capture Kharkov, but they wouldn't have been trapped and destroyed. The disaster resulted from specific bad decisions made by identifiable individuals at specific moments. It wasn't an inevitable result of Soviet technological inferiority or German tactical superiority. It was leadership failure, pure and simple. The fact that this leadership failure was predicted by competent military professional whose warnings were ignored makes the disaster especially tragic and especially instructive about dangers of political interference in military operations.